This video is brought to you by, you guessed it, Squarespace. Nils Christie once proposed a question in his essay, The Ideal Victim, to ask the reader, think of a time where you have been the victim. This question was asked in order to prompt the reader to consider past circumstances that affected them negatively. Except, there is another question that can be asked in itself, so let me propose an alternative one to you. What do you think of when you think of the word victim? Now that in itself is a very loaded concept. One shaped by a variety of factors, including but not limited to things like past experiences and current social norms. Maybe it's someone in a very vulnerable state, someone unable to protect themselves from a traumatic incident or person, or even from a series of events, who is without agency and power, possibly a child, an elder, or a typical damsel in distress archetype of a young woman who is naive to the ways of the world and how it may want to harm her. In the world of the internet, media buzzwords are everywhere. Victim blaming, playing the oppression card, problematic, toxic, cancelled, etc. All of these terms can both put a victim into a state of idolarity and also dehumanize their experiences to such an extent that they too are examples, shiny media examples, or cautionary tales. Quite often, the human aspect behind those stories is forgotten. But then, what about those who find themselves in the middle? What about those who don't fit the mold of the idealized victim? Christie presents a scenario in which there is an ideal victim and a non-ideal victim within his famous essay on this. The victim is weak. Sick, old, or very young people are particularly well suited as ideal victims. The victim was carrying out a respectable project, caring for her sister, for example. She was where she could not possibly be blamed for being, in the street during the daytime. The offender was big and bad. The offender was unknown and in no personal relationship to her. A contrasting example of a far from ideal victim would be a young man hanging around in a bar, hit on the head by an acquaintance who took his money. His head might be more severely hurt than that of the old lady, his money more dear to him. Nonetheless, he could not compete with her for getting the status as an ideal victim. He was strong. He was not carrying out any respectable project. He could and should have protected himself by not being there. He was as big as the offender, and he was close to the offender. And by proxy, this has caused a significant intrigue as to how different types of characters are portrayed and perceived in Western media specifically. And so this is what we'll be looking into today. Hello everyone, this is Fionapollo, and today's video is actually a joint effort between myself and my partner Rain, a look into the ways in which victims are looked at both in the lens of their respective narratives, as well as how their victimhood is received by the audiences. Today we'll be delving into a handful of case studies that focus on various characters across different series and franchises. Most are animated series, however there is a game thrown in there as well, which I think people will find quite interesting. Nevertheless, I invite you all to continue watching if this piques your interest, and if you like what we have to say, please consider liking and subscribing. It's always appreciated. This has been a really introspective topic to look into, and I'm really glad we were able to do it together. Please just note though that while we have done a fair bit of research into this, any opinions expressed are purely speculative and not based in fact, unless evidence is given to state the contrary. So I will ask again, so that you can all provide your own thoughts on this before the video continues. What do you think of when you think of the word victim? Please let us know. Now, before we get into the meat and bones of today's topic, I do have an obligation to fill, and that is to inform you all about today's oh-so-wonderful sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is an online website building platform that allows you to cultivate your own personal online experience to do with as you so choose. You can select from a whole trove of pre-made website templates that can be edited and altered however you like, or you can build it up completely from scratch thanks to Fluid Engine that allows for an entire world of possibilities. Are you hoping to create your own personal blog, portfolio, or online store? Squarespace has everything you need, ranging from top-of-the-range transaction capabilities, gallery options, inventory, and payment methods. You even have the option to isolate and password protect any pages should you wish to use them for professional pursuits such as a job application. The sky and your internet connection are your only limits. I myself have been using Squarespace to create an info hub for not only my channel but also my indie short series Mint and Friends. The next Mint and Friends short, by the way, will be going live in March, so feel free to check out my website after watching if you want to know more about the series and its characters. Like the sound of all that? Well then, you better hurry on over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and once you're ready to go live, head to squarespace.com/FionApollo to save 10% off of your first website or domain. And with all of that said, let's carry on with the video. Case Study 1. Arcane. So the research for this case study is largely drawn upon from the video Medarda Deserves Better, addressing misogyny in the Arcane fandom by Naya Wrights. Please be sure to give Naya's video a watch when you're done here. It is incredibly insightful and well written. Now, it would be remiss of this essay not to talk about the media's portrayals of what the ideal victim is and not mention the blatant erasure of nuance when it comes to the reception of complex women of colour within fandom culture specifically, especially when they serve as an apparent obstacle in the way of a popular MLM ship. And while there are many cases of this occurring both in media and real life, I specifically wanted to use Medarda as a case study and compare her to what I consider to be her thematic counterpart in Arcane, Victor. I do understand the critique surrounding both characters, especially when veering off into their respective storylines in Season 2, but this will mostly be focused on fan reactions and developer reactions to these characters and their expressions of trauma, and the ways their characters can be reduced in these fandom circles that I believe does a disservice to both of them. It's no secret that at the beginning of Arcane, both of these characters couldn't be on further ends of the ladder of privilege. Victor is a genius inventor overlooked constantly due to his background of coming from Zorn, coupled with him having a terminal illness caused by environmental oppression and poverty literally poisoning the waters near where he lived. Medarda's opening scene shows her as the richest person in Piltover as she glides over potential investment opportunities in an almost fox-like manner with a poised, playful intrigue, yet still dissatisfied as she is boxed in as being the, quote, poorest Medarda. However, what is interesting is that there is a portion in Nils Christie's essay where he talks at length about the non-ideal victim and uses an analogy of the witch and the worker. And we're going to be using this framework to discuss fan reception as to why people might sway more toward one character than the other. Victor has all of the ingredients to perfect the recipe for a sympathetic, complicated character. He has obstacles he desperately tries to overcome, a dream that society trips him up over for daring to try and realise, and a snarky personality pasted on a twink-esque frame with messy hair. Kidding. I'm kidding. I'm not kidding. Couple that with the eventual android Jesus powers in Season 2 and a skewed up sense of trying to, quote, save everyone by putting them in a cult of ceramic dreamless dolls and a hate-love relationship that echoes lovers to enemies. Is it any wonder people can relate to him? In a more serious tone, Victor is a disabled, terminally ill man at the start of the series with a mind that's bright in a world that tries to snuff it out. He's a working man, and like Christie notes in his essay, he's an avatar for depersonalized responsibilities for living in working conditions amongst the poorest of us. He doesn't have an offender making him a victim, because the world building already makes him one without it when he's introduced. Mel, however, is an interesting case. Putting her in the lens of the victim, ideal or not, is almost oxymoronic if we take her purely at face value. She's a politician when first introduced, and a schemer at that. She's able to navigate her penchant for social awareness to mold whatever lures her latest investment into a comforted, reassured state. Although her desire for peace may be genuine, the fact that she would use stalemate tactics of developing hextech weaponry in order to ensure mutually assured coexistence with the threat of destruction may seem logical at first, but it does highlight the fact that Mel is a politician in a position of privilege. She has the option to enforce this sort of ideology simply because she's in the seat to do so, and yet her motivations can be summed up in the flashback the audience is shown to us about her mother and Bessa, showing her the brutality of war. Repeating her brother Kino's words, she states that war is a failure of statecraft. Noxus is a nation infamous for its militaristic conquest, and Mel founded an identity in diplomacy despite that. She does not covet the large power of a heightened military to wield it, but to use the threat of it like a needle, making a point known about the sharpness and keeping her city together without the seams fraying. Although Christie's allegories of witches falls within the older women being stripped of their importance in comparison to medieval times, and thus society's view was more respect and fear than it was of pity and guilt of social isolation in comparison to today, Mel's being a social navigator and practicing manipulative diplomacy is in line with the idea of the small, secretive amount of power being more terrifying to comprehend for people than those with a large sword and imposing stature, with the fanfare of war at their back. The fandom response to these two characters is really interesting, and honestly quite telling when it comes to the portrayal of their trauma or even just their development and experiences throughout the story. Although simmered down now, it isn't hard to come across critique after critique of Mel's character in comparison to Victor, whose storyline is often criticised for not giving him more positive aspects. Neither of these criticisms are flawed in of themselves, however, the attitudes of fandom being so laser focused on picking apart Mel's character, and especially in regards to a relationship to Jace versus Victor's relationship with him, is just fascinating in in a lot of weird and often wrong ways, it feels. Watching through the story again, especially in season 1, there's a gradual progression of Mel's protectiveness towards Jace told beautifully through her ever-evolving facial expressions. The flagship of this, in my opinion, being where Jace lays in her lap after fleeing from their night together after realizing Victor's health is declining. There is a surprising amount of vulnerability and humility from Jace that Mel doesn't expect, coupled with the honesty that he wants to do better by society. To me, this speaks volumes for Mel not having anticipated this. She wasn't counting on such raw honesty and having it align with her views of wanting to better the city that they both love. She may be good at navigating the political sphere, but even her motivations began from somewhere earnest, and she never is one to advocate for harming others. Just having a frosty stalemate at the threat, which in of itself has the potential to create victims on its own. It's saddening to me that this aspect of their relationship and development is so often overlooked in fandom circles. Contrast this with Victor, whose gradual disconnect from Jace after the events of season 1 leads him to resolving to fix the world by, essentially his own admission, putting everyone into dreamless solitude. It's ironic just how much of Mel's traits he embraces in this season, in my opinion. He makes an underhanded deal with Singed. He knows the correct words to say to have others join his cause in order to heal them, but rather than become a social navigator to play on people's emotions in order to further his cause, Victor strips people of them in the name of healing. There's no manipulation when your very personhood is scrubbed away. Both Mel and Victor suffer from harm in the society they tried to embrace this season. Mel by trying to forge an identity through diplomacy after being outcast by her mother because her soft heart caused Ambessa to question herself, only later to find out that her entire identity had been what she calls a passenger. Victor by the hand that fate dealt to him with his health, his position in society, and the disrespect that came along with it due to ingrained ableism and classism. Yet fandom culture leads the perception of these characters to be different. I personally don't hold the opinion that these characters had it worse than the other, as each has their shades of trauma that I don't fully understand myself, but there is a clear preferential treatment in the fandom between Mel and Victor. Naya Wrights brought up an excellent point in her video on Mel Medarda deserving better, in her analysis that Mel, as a black woman, was often shown in the fandom as being little more than an afterthought to Jace's development, or even her relationship with Jace itself being criticised as not even relevant to the story. This is shown even by the animators of the show at times, with a live stream even reducing the relationship to a mere hookup where Jace was obviously thinking about his boy the whole time. I don't know, that just speaks to the objectification of both of them in a sense. Victor's story is more than just an angsty disabled pretty boy who has a friend's enemy's lover's arc. He is not a prop in a love story for Jace to save from himself. Victor is a man who was desperate to cure his own affliction and did so at the cost of his humanity due to the manufactured poverty of the world he lived in, victimized by an unfair system that everyone around him deemed he should be grateful for to get the chance to participate in. He wanted to change the world for the better, and had to recycle his humanity countless times to even try. Similarly, Mel is so much more than the idea of a manipulative, scheming black woman who would step on the toes of those she cares about to further her ambitions. Mel is an example of a complicated black woman with admirable and critiquable traits. She is someone who was outcasted from her family for the idea of being too soft, but the real truth of her origin was hidden from her until a traumatic experience of being locked in a prison, and the key was to kill the image of her dead brother. To be the best of her family and save it, she had to scrape away the worst aspects of it, even if it meant embracing aspects of the ideology she had fought to get away from, even if it meant sacrificing her mother to do so, because like Jace said, she is no passenger and nobody can control her. Both characters have agency at times in their stories and have it ripped away from them in other parts. Both are the antagonists of a certain viewpoint in their own stories, and even understand their motives do not mean you have to endorse or enable them, but understanding that they can be multi-layered and seeing that they have complexity in their victimhood in a world they help shape, it allows these characters to have nuance outside of their relationships to a pretty man, which, to be honest, Jace is kind of a mess in season 2, let's be for real. Maybe this can allow others to have less vitriol or idolization and actually see the worth beyond that in the stories they're telling, but we can only hope. Case study 2, Life is Strange. So I am just going to put a little trigger warning in here for physical and intimate abuse being mentioned. Just be aware of this, please. While social media can be credited as giving more awareness to victims and their voices, let's not forget that it also allows for more scrutiny to be given to their every single action, right down to their facial expressions not being correct, as grief, trauma, and pain cannot just be tick-boxed and blanketed to encompass every single human being. I will need to credit Geek Remix for this portion of the video, as rewatching this analysis of Kate and Chloe and the portrayal of what a perfect victim is, even 6 years later, still holds a lot of water. It was while watching this video that inspired us for this next case study of Kate Marsh and Rachel Amber her in the serialized video game Life is Strange. It's important to note that Kate and Rachel share a very similar backstory in the game in regards to their private trauma. Both were taken to the Prescott family storm bunker by fellow student Nathan Prescott to be bound and photographed in sick, twisted versions of emotive artistic expression by Mark Jefferson, an authority figure who was a teacher at the school that gained both of their trusts under the guise of being an understanding, empathetic individual. In Kate's case, she was his assistant, and in Rachel's, he groomed her into thinking they were in a reciprocal romantic relationship. However, while their private trauma unites them in experience, the public portrayal of these two young women in the game couldn't be more different. Kate is someone I cannot help but see similarities to the titular character of Tess of the D'Urbervilles, a pure woman, published by Thomas Hardy in 1891, a novel depicting a character who had experienced SA through an authority figure, in this case, Tess's employer. Much like Tess, Kate is a devoutly religious figure who experiences SA trauma both in the public eye and privately. For Kate's case, the public depiction of her trauma happened after she attended a college party, had her drink spiked, and was caught on video making out with several party attendants with her inhibitions lowered, with the video later being released online. It's made clear that Kate does not remember what transpired for the rest of the night, but knows deep down that something bad happened to her that she can't explain. Thomas Hardy portrays Tess as a woman almost free of flaw or sin, and that what happened to her shouldn't mark her, which, considering the time period, was most likely Hardy playing to his audience to experience sympathy for an otherwise controversial figure. A very similar thing happened with Kate, which I wonder if this is a deliberate choice by the developers. In the game, the video that was taken of her is never explicitly shown to the player past a few references and screenshots that Max has access to, and even the photographs that the player is able to see when exploring the bunker with Chloe later on in the story is most likely not the whole album, which is most likely Max influencing the narrative by what she will and will not view out of respect for her friend. The photographs themselves are designed to show Kate in the most vulnerable state she could be. She is, in every sense of the word, the ideal victim in personality, but not in circumstance. Going back to Nils Christie's definition, Kate has shades of this. She's a white Christian teenage girl, almost free of flaws, who tries to do everything right in the eyes of society, talk to an authority figure about getting help, withdraw from public attention, speak to her parents about the incident, and the game is not shy at showing just how much society is failing her. There are characters constantly belittling and bullying Kate by saying she must have asked for it, and how she obviously enjoyed it based on the video shared despite her vocal opposition to such a notion. A character in a position of authority even quotes that she doth protest too much, which in hindsight, knowing it was him who victimized her, gross. Jail. Death penalty. What makes it worse is that Kate's position as a victim, much like her experience, was forced onto her. She never consented to having that video showing her in such a state of vulnerability shared. She's made a public victim to scrutiny against her will, and the private trauma is something even she doesn't know about. Kate Marsh isn't even afforded the decency of deciding when it was her time to be public about the trauma she went through, because that's stolen from her. It's only when Max, and by extension you, the player, are sympathetic to her plight that you have to pick apart all of the clues you've learned about her to try and save her life when the depression becomes too much. If you do save her, or don't, only then is a lesson learned by someone going to the opposite extreme, and then, only then, do the same detractors who bullied her mercilessly finally turn a page and treat her sympathetically online. The same avenue of broadcasting that made her unable to escape the scrutiny. She is now unable to escape those parading around her attempt on her life in order to make themselves look better. Because although she may be the ideal victim in personality, she is not the ideal victim in circumstance to what led to her assault. After all, for some, it's entertaining to see someone so demure, quiet, and good as her suddenly lose it. Who cares about her feelings in the fallout, you know? Watching the hot, cold portrayals of who she is and who she really is become popcorn media to those around her. And yet, unlike Kate, Rachel is a character who has a spectrum of opinions about her. Characters who are jealous of her revile her, whilst those who are close to her, Chloe, almost idolize her, with the latter even likening her to an angel who saved her. Within the original game, Life is Strange, Rachel has no voice, no means to argue back against these notions. There are no videos of her sparking controversy or going viral, as she herself was already a controversial figure in the town of Arcadia Bay to the point of it going stale, save for those most embittered by her reputation. Throughout the game, Chloe struggles to keep Rachel's image alive, with missing posters being torn down around town as she searches for any information about her whereabouts. As with the exception of Chloe, no one seems to care now that the story isn't fresh. It isn't interesting anymore. Rachel is noted for hanging around sketchy dives, befriending the unsavory types, and is noted for being flirtatious, with a rumor even going around that she had sex with a teacher. It's a normal almost calloused silence in how people don't actively try and look for her anymore, barely even mentioning her save for degrading gossip. As if her going missing eventually was an occupational hazard, a foregone conclusion. Rachel Amber, too, has her public and private trauma woven into the narrative of the story. Her public trauma is her disappearance, and is a struggle to be kept relevant through the voice of those who care about her. And yet this negative reputation this girl suffers, even after her death, is a direct result of authority figures taking advantage of her starstruck reception of them. In this case, Rachel is also drugged, photographed, and murdered by Nathan Prescott, being coached by Mark Jefferson. Technically, Rachel cheats on Chloe and Frank, the drug dealer of the town who himself even notes that she was too young to be with him, as a result of Mark Jefferson, a man in a position of authority, literally grooming her through promise of making her dreams come true, to get out of this town and away from the trauma that drags her down, and she dies for it. And all people can do is gossip in the wake of her ghosting the narrative. Rachel is the antithesis of the ideal victim because all of her trauma happened as a result of situations that she put herself in. But see, Rachel is messy. Rachel is layered and human, and the consequences of her actions are a ripple effect in the story that is still felt. Except she isn't allowed a chance to feel them or conclude them. She isn't allowed closure. The only way Rachel gets to vent her anger of her assault and murder that was only uncovered through the persistence of those desperate to keep her memory alive in the narrative is through a deus ex machina of a storm engulfing Arcadia Bay. Yet even this is just a theory proposed by Chloe, after she herself struggles with the revelation that Rachel was just going to run away with someone other than her after finding a penned letter to Chloe explaining about her relationship with Jefferson. Whilst Chloe gets closure with the consequences of Rachel's flawed actions, continuing to advocate for her after making peace with it, Rachel cannot do the same. Rachel Amber has no way to tie up loose ends of her story. Only ideal victims going to the extreme of distress are even afforded a chance of that, not reckless girls who apparently ask to be harmed. Case Study 3. Avatar. For this case study, we're going to take a look at one of the more beloved characters of Avatar, The Last Airbender. But who, you may ask? Is it Zuko, Katara, Aang, Toph? There are indeed a great many candidates for such a topic within this universe, but today, we'll actually be discussing Iroh. Alright, so let's face it, we've all heard the internet throw confetti behind the masterpiece that is Zuko's redemption arc. We get it, he's fantastic. You can't go to any corner of the internet talking about villain to protagonist storylines without at least one person whispering his name and proclaiming that it was the pinnacle of writing. And, well, yeah, it was. But one aspect of Christie's essay stuck out to us in particular, and it's the scenario he puts forth as a means to show the ideal offender and the ideal victim. A man lurking in the shadows attempting to purse snatch a helpless old lady. Well, General Iroh is no lady, although I paid to see that on Drag Race. But this immediately took me to one of Avatar The Last Airbender's greatest achievements, Iroh's tale of Ba Sing Se. Within the world of Avatar, Iroh is more than just Zuko's tea-loving, goofy uncle who sticks with him when times are tough. When introduced, and slowly unraveled more as the seasons go on, Iroh is revealed to be a seasoned, retired war general, surprisingly insightful of the other nations with a deep respect for the spiritual balance of the world of Avatar, and a skill in combat on par with the Fire Lord himself, even stated in the show to be the only one outside of Aang with a chance of beating him. The past of his warmongering days are not shown on screen, but they are explicitly referenced in flashbacks, with one particular example of his failure to breach the walls of Ba Sing Se. In this regard, Iroh, being a retired war general, should have his character on the side of the antagonistic, a large, imposing war figure set to extend his family's victorious reach in the war. But then there is his story in Tales of Ba Sing Se. There is a presence of joy in his face. He saunters around the city that he attempted to conquer, purchasing items for a special occasion, and even sings a song to a crying child in order to elicit joy for them. It's a non-consequential day for Iroh, until he, much like in Christie's analogy, is held at knife point by a would-be thief in an alleyway. By all intents and purposes, this sets up Iroh to be the ideal victim, the image of a hapless old man, defenseless, after doing his best to cheer up a crying child. But like many literary devices utilized in Avatar, this is inverted. It is in fact the offender who is upturned and sympathetic in the awkward way he positions himself to hold Iroh at knife point, and Iroh, this apparent old man, who the audience know to be a skilled retired war general, who has the agency and superior skill in fighting, is the one who upheaves the expectation and knocks the younger man to the ground. And yet, instead of going about his day, Iroh extends a hand and an ear. He listens to the man's woes, poverty, and lack of self-confidence preventing him from going for his dreams, until Iroh states explicitly that he believes he can do it. Iroh brings a sense of renewed hope to this man, with a few well-placed words and a kind gesture, and from both perspectives, it can be hard to identify just who is supposed to be the victim victim and who is supposed to be the assailant. The lines get a little blurry when one takes time to understand another. Many of those in the fandom speak to the brilliance of Iroh's character, and the heartstrings pulled at his relationship with Zuko, and all those are contenders for the best aspect of his character, but it's important to remember the beginnings of Iroh's story, because he does not forget it. At the end of his tale in this episode, he walks up to a hill, sky blazing red, and lays out burning incense next to a picture of his deceased son. He sits on that hill by himself, and sings a song of remembrance. Brave soldier boy. He participated in this war, as did his son, and his son didn't get to return. His son did not come marching home. This war of conquest began generations before he was even born, and it was the thing that killed him. War can make offenders and victims of any of us, witnessing heinous acts that both strip humanity away and humble those who are unlucky enough to become traumatized by it. Iroh truly is a fascinating character when we look at him from this angle, and it does prompt you to stop and ponder just what others who are privy to his past actions must think. To a neighbouring nation inhabitant, possibly a surviving army member, Iroh must be a formidable and terrifying presence, even despite how he is shown to behave during the events of the show. He destroyed countless lives, and yet here he is, travelling with his highly reactive and aggressive nephew without a care as to the carnage they've both inflicted. Their single goal is to locate the new Avatar and take him out of this world before he has a chance to help those who are suffering. To his own family, or those in the Fire Nation who respect the achievements earned in battle, he is likely seen as a shell of who he once was. A great army general, after having his son taken away from him far too soon, is now reduced to a tea-obsessed, conflict-avoidant babysitter. Perhaps his old war comrades pity him for this. As Christie says, there are too few monsters around. Most offenders are non-ideal. They are in most of their relationships, and in most of their attributes like other people. Iroh does many good things in the series, standing up to try and save the Moon Spirit, joining Team Avatar in a bid to take down the Fire Lord, refusing to battle the Fire Lord as he does not want another family plot to be what ends the war, and even concealing the last of the dragons so that they would be left in peace. But he also advanced a war that stole many other sons, daughters, and parents. At one point, he even gloated about it in a letter to his niece and nephew with a jovial casualness to it. But he learned. Perhaps the most painful lesson he could ever learn. The complexity of war damages both the young and the old. And all of this tragedy was for a war that was started over a century prior. He did not have a hand in starting it, so it's a cause that he was raised to believe was righteous. I can't help but think of characters like Jet in this instance as well. Much like Iroh's son, died too young in a war that won't allow time for grief, and Jet himself was radicalized into believing bombing a town full of innocents, including Fire Nation children, was the only way his people would be free, because he'd seen his whole childhood engulfed in flames. I believe Iroh, after his son died, had a moment like Jet where he himself was asked, when did he stop protecting innocent people? Avatar parallels the grief of war and the unfairness of it all, because who would these people be if they did not have to suffer under its weight? Iroh is neither offender nor victim. He is its synthesis, and trying to do better so others like his nephew Zuko don't have to suffer the same fate.
Did Jet just die? You know, it was really unclear.
Honourable Mentions. Infinity Train. Honestly, the entire cast could be analysed under this, but a standout of the ideal victim concept is probably Simon and Grace from the show's 3rd season. Simon is a character who has a flashback with how he met Grace, showing him as an ideal victim. A young boy abandoned by his caretaker in a world he doesn't know, pursued by a monster until Grace, another child, saves his life. Yet with every story beat in the season that offers him means of being a better person, Simon eventually becomes the monster that everyone else is running from and is consumed by his own self-righteousness and pain until he meets his end. Grace is introduced in Season 2 as an antagonistic character who, alongside Simon, seeks to overthrow the train by murdering its denizens and who worships Amelia as the correct conductor, despite Amelia herself twisting the train's capabilities for her own machinations. Over the course of the season, we unravel Grace's own pain and see her struggle with this, which led her to such extremes in the first place. Unlike Simon, her story ends with her making peace with the denizens of the train at the end of the story with an aim to do better by the children who are in her care, but it's unresolved. Neither of these are the ideal victim or monster. At the end of the day, they're damaged children who grew up to be damaged people. And this is where I have to desperately scream into the void, why was this show cancelled? Finally, our last series to be mentioned is BoJack Horseman. Again, the entire cast could fall into this. From Diane struggling with her self-worth during her relationships with men, to Princess Carolyn breaking off an entirely decent and good relationship because of her struggles with infertility, and even BoJack's literal everything. Another example that may best exemplify this is Beatrice Horseman, the titular character's mother. She is the root cause of BoJack's victimization. She was a critical, neglectful alcoholic whose projected insecurities ruined whatever chance BoJack had of regulating regulating his own negative emotions. And we see that she too had her own Beatrice Horseman. We see her as a child, falling off a slide. We see her brother die and her mother's descent into her grief, only to have it literally cut away at the behest of her emotionally neglectful and sexist father. Dream after dream is snatched away and the cycle repeats. She victimizes others, but it wasn't always that way. It's never always just that way. So with everything we've discussed today, I will ask you all one more time. What do you think of when you think of the word victim? Perhaps now you may be thinking about someone who, despite having privilege in other respects, is picked apart mercilessly to the point where their victimhood is either called into question or overlooked entirely in favour of someone else. Perhaps it's someone who is terminally ill and whose desperation drives them to become an antagonist of their own story. Maybe it's a young girl who has been through so much and walks two potential paths of victimhood, either becoming a martyr or become a virtue signal for others to tout around for their own benefit. A victim may also possibly make you think of an old man, hardened but also ravaged by the horrors of war, consumed with guilt over the past atrocities which in turn fall back on him and cost him dearly. Whatever you may choose to believe, victimhood comes in so many forms in media, and its many interpretations when concerning just animation alone are only the tip of the iceberg. As with real life, it can take the smallest of things for a victim to either be believed or condemned for their circumstances, and looking at it through the lens of media really does open your eyes to just how broad this can really be. It's up to us as viewers to look at these portrayals on screen and really reflect on who we deem as victims, ideal or not, why we feel that way, and what it would take to sway us to one side of thinking or the other. Only then can we really hope to understand such a thing from viewpoints that we may not have even considered. And finally, there is no right or wrong way to be a victim. Anyway, that is all we have for you today. Thank you ever so much for watching, and I really do hope you enjoyed. Thank you to my fantastic partner for all the research done into these case studies. This was really nice to work on together. Thank you as well, of course, to my wonderful Patreon supporters. Thank you to my YouTube peeps, Jesse Sparks, Manuel Legzon Gonzalez, Ash Valentine, Mystic Mind, Lauren R, Pedantic Cat, Ed Boy, Hero Sky Arts, and Stefka's Doodles. And an extra special thank you to my indie production supporters, Morgan LaFay de Thin, Matty A, Kiyoshi, and Roundcat. If you'd like to become a patron yourself, a link to my page can be found in the video description. Again, thank you all so much. This was a really interesting video to work on. I don't know about you guys, but I think I'm gonna put a face mask on, eat some chocolate, and watch Legally Blonde once I'm all wrapped up here. Yeah, that sounds nice. Oh, maybe I'll torment Olive as well. You're the real victim here, aren't you, sweetheart? Getting barraged with unwanted affection. Yeah, she's just looking at me like I'm I don't even know why I bother. She just looks at me like I'm an idiot. Stay safe, everyone, and I will speak to you very soon. Bye!